In the sweltering August of 1774, New York City exhaled a heavy, salt-laden breath. Within the elegant Bailey residence, a child's first cry pierced the humid air. Little Elizabeth Ann entered a world of polished mahogany and revolutionary whispers, unaware of the divine burden she was born to carry. Her father, Dr. Richard Bailey, stood by the window, his mind a labyrinth of anatomical precision and colonial tension. He looked at his newborn daughter, seeing a legacy of social grace. Yet, beneath the fine linens, a restless spirit stirred, destined for a path far beyond Manhattan's elite. The scent of lavender and expensive wax filled the nursery, shielding the infant from the brewing storms outside. New York was a city on the edge of transformation, much like the soul of Saint Elizabeth. Here, amidst the aristocratic comfort, the quiet light of her future began to flicker. Tragedy struck early, stealing the warmth of her mother's embrace when Saint Elizabeth was merely 3. The silence in the hallways became her first tutor in spiritual solitude. She sought comfort in the rustle of autumn leaves, instinctively reaching for a father who could never be taken away. Despite the void, her father's rigorous intellect shaped her mind like a sculptor working marble. Dr. Bailey demanded self-restraint and intellectual clarity, unintentionally forging the iron will she would later need. Saint Elizabeth learned that virtue was not a gift, but a fortress built through daily, quiet discipline. A small wooden crucifix often rested against her youthful chest, a silent witness to her growing interior life. While other maidens dreamed of silken balls, Saint Elizabeth found her heartbeat in the rhythmic beauty of the Psalms. The ancient Hebrew poetry resonated within her like a distant, holy thunder. She walked the cobblestone streets of Staten Island, observing the sharp contrast between her privilege and the beggar's rags. Her soul felt a strange, persistent ache, a holy dissatisfaction with the vanity of high society. Even then, Saint Elizabeth felt the invisible pull toward a much deeper, darker sea. This gilded cradle was but a temporary vessel for a spirit meant for the tempest. The comfort of her Anglican upbringing provided the roots, but the fruit would be harvested in sacrifice. In the heart of old New York, a future mother of the poor was quietly awakening. The scent of vinegar and sharp lye clung to the heavy curtains of the Bailey household, a constant reminder of death's proximity. Young Saint Elizabeth watched her father, Dr. Richard Bailey, through the cracked door of his study. He moved with a cold, surgical precision that chilled the air. In the late 18th century, New York was a city of shadows, where yellow fever lurked like a silent predator. Saint Elizabeth saw her father return from the docks, his coat smelling of the harbor's brine and the sickly sweet rot of the infected. He was a man of science. Dr. Bailey viewed the human body as a complex machine of bone and sinew, yet Saint Elizabeth sensed the missing soul within his diagrams. He demanded a stoic discipline from her, forging her spirit in the furnace of self-restraint. Every morning, she rose to meet his unyielding, silent expectations. "Self-denial is the bedrock of virtue, Elizabeth," he would mutter without looking up from his anatomical sketches. Saint Elizabeth nodded, her small fingers tracing the worn edges of her Bible. She learned to find God not in the ease of comfort, but in the sharp edges of difficult duty. The cries of the dying echoed from the quarantine tents near the shoreline, haunting her restless, youthful dreams. While her father sought the physical cause of the plague, Saint Elizabeth knelt in the moonlight, praying for the eternal rest of the nameless. She felt the heavy weight of human suffering. Hunger and fatigue were mere tests of the will in the Bailey house, a rigorous training for an unknown future. Saint Elizabeth often walked the lonely beaches, the cold Atlantic spray stinging her face. She wondered if the Creator required the same relentless, clinical perfection as her earthly father did. Deep within her heart, a quiet light began to glow, illuminating the darkness of the doctor's cold, sterile world. Saint Elizabeth realized that science could map the veins, but only grace could heal the spirit's hidden wounds. She prepared her soul to become a vessel for a much greater physician. As the plague years waned, the girl emerged as a woman of tempered steel and profound, hidden empathy. Saint Elizabeth had looked into the eyes of the dying and seen the face of Christ. The anatomist's daughter was ready to trade the scalpel for the cross, forever changed by the shadow. The bells of St. Paul's Church rang with a silver clarity on that cold January morning in 1794. Saint Elizabeth, draped in delicate lace, felt her heart skip as she looked into William McGee Seton's eyes. It was a union of two souls destined for a brief, luminous summer. William was the heir to a vast mercantile empire, a man of charm and gentle spirit, who mirrored her own hidden depths. In their early years, the New York high society seemed to bow before their radiant happiness. Saint Elizabeth embraced the role of a wife with a sacred, quiet joy. Their home was filled with the scent of fresh lilies and the sound of 5 children's laughter echoing through the halls. Prosperity flowed like a calm river, yet Saint Elizabeth never let the silk of her gowns dull her spirit. She sensed that earthly wealth was but a fleeting, golden shadow. "My William, the world is so kind to us today," she whispered one evening by the fireplace. He smiled, pressing her hand, yet a faint cough escaped his chest, a sound as sharp as a breaking twig. Saint Elizabeth felt a sudden, icy shiver, a premonition of the darkening clouds ahead. She moved through the grand parlors of Manhattan, always wearing her small crucifix, a steady anchor in a sea of vanity. While others discussed trade and fashion, Saint Elizabeth saw the face of the Creator in her husband's weary eyes. Their love was becoming a sanctuary against a brewing storm. Even in the height of their success, she spent her afternoons with Rebecca Seton, visiting the damp basements of the poor. Saint Elizabeth realized that the true riches were not in their ledgers, but in the bread shared with the hungry. Her heart was being stretched by a divine, invisible hand. The merchant ships of the Seton firm sailed the vast Atlantic, bringing wealth that seemed endless to the casual observer. But Saint Elizabeth watched the horizon with a growing, prayerful intensity. She knew that every wave that rose must eventually fall back into the deep, mysterious silence of God. This was the vibrant summer of her life, a season of profound human love and domestic grace. Saint Elizabeth cherished every moment, yet she prepared her soul for the autumn. The union of hearts was a beautiful prelude to a much more difficult, solitary song of pure, uncompromising faith. The heavy oak doors of the Seton counting house seemed to groan under an invisible weight in 1798. Saint Elizabeth watched from the shadows as the ledgers, once symbols of golden stability, began to bleed red ink. The merchant ships were vanished, swallowed by the relentless Atlantic waves. A chilling silence descended upon the grand estate when the patriarch, William's father, drew his final rattling breath. Saint Elizabeth felt the foundations of her world tremble, realizing that the pillars of wealth were but brittle reeds. The vibrant summer of her life was turning into a cold, gray autumn. My William, the debts are like shadows that grow longer each evening, she whispered, her voice trembling with a new, sharp fear. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with exhaustion and the creeping rot of illness. Saint Elizabeth realized that their gilded American dream was merely a fragile house of cards. The scent of expensive cigars and fine brandy was replaced by the bitter aroma of ink and dusty legal papers. Saint Elizabeth spent her nights calculating the ruins, her fingers stained by the very world that was discarding them. She was learning the agonizing weight of earthly responsibility and its inevitable, hollow failure. Amidst the mounting chaos of bankruptcy, her favorite refuge, her father, Dr. Bailey, also succumbed to the relentless grip of fever. Saint Elizabeth stood by his grave, the cold New York wind whipping her veil like a mourning flag. She offered the life of her infant daughter to God for his soul. The once bright parlors felt hollow, haunted by the ghosts of creditors and the whispers of fair-weather friends who had vanished. Saint Elizabeth saw the masks of high society fall away, revealing a skeletal vanity that chilled her to the marrow. She found herself standing alone in a desert of social ruin. "Is this the end of our journey, Lord?" she cried out in the biting cold of her private oratory. No voice answered, yet a strange, quiet light flickered within the deep recesses of her soul. Saint Elizabeth realized that the stripping away of her possessions was a preparation for a much greater divine inheritance. She looked at her 5 children, their faces pale reflections of their father's waning health, and felt a fierce, protective love. Saint Elizabeth prepared to lead them through the wreckage, her heart tempered by the first cracks of suffering. The cross was no longer an ornament. It was becoming her only reality. The wooden hull of the ship groaned against the relentless Atlantic, a hollow sound that echoed the emptiness in Saint Elizabeth's heart. Salt spray bit at her cheeks as she stood on the heaving deck, watching New York's shoreline vanish into a gray, misty shroud of memory. Inside the cramped, damp cabin, William lay like a broken shadow, his breath a ragged whistle that tore through the silence. Saint Elizabeth knelt beside him, the scent of brine and medicinal spirits thick in the stagnant air. She was fighting a ghost for her husband's very life. "The sea air will be a balm, William. Just hold on," she whispered, though her own soul felt as restless as the churning waves. Saint Elizabeth gripped her small crucifix, feeling the jagged edges press into her palm. The vast ocean offered no comfort, only an unyielding, watery silence. Every lurch of the vessel sent a shudder through William's frail frame, his eyes searching hers, for a hope she struggled to maintain. Saint Elizabeth saw the flickering candle of his life struggling against the draft of eternity. She felt the terrifying isolation of a soul adrift. The sailors' rhythmic chants and the snapping of canvas were the only melodies in this floating purgatory. Saint Elizabeth spent her nights in prayerful vigil, the rhythmic swaying of the ship mimicking the pendulum of her own anxiety. She was being stripped of every earthly anchor, one by one. Storms lashed the timber, the sky turning a bruised purple that mirrored the growing fatigue in her bone. Saint Elizabeth realized that this voyage was not merely across an ocean, but toward a profound spiritual precipice. The Lord was leading her into the heart of the great, dark deep. "Lord, be our pilot in this sunless waste," she cried silently as the mast creaked under the weight of the gale. Saint Elizabeth felt the frailty of human ambition against the majesty of the elements. She was a mother, a wife, and now a weary pilgrim of the sea. As the Italian coast finally appeared as a jagged line of hope, the weight of the unknown pressed harder. Saint Elizabeth looked at her eldest daughter, seeing her own fear reflected in the girl's eyes. The Atlantic ghost had pursued them, but a much greater encounter awaited. The iron gates of the lazaretto at Leghorn slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a hammer on a coffin. Saint Elizabeth found herself trapped within cold, weeping stone walls, the air thick with the smell of salt and ancient dampness. It was a tomb for the living. A single barred window offered a sliver of the gray Italian sky, but no warmth reached their shivering bodies. William lay on a hard pallet, his cough shattering the heavy silence of the quarantine cell. Saint Elizabeth wrapped her arms around her daughter, feeling the bite of the winter. "My God, is this the mercy we sought across the ocean?" she cried silently, her breath misting in the freezing air. The silence was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating presence that tested the very marrow of her soul. Saint Elizabeth felt the terrifying weight of divine abandonment. The guards brought meager rations of bread and water, their faces masked in fear of the plague. Saint Elizabeth watched the shadows lengthen across the stone floor, tracing the slow passage of 30 agonizing days. She was being stripped of every earthly comfort in this desolate, smell-it limestone purgatory. She knelt on the cold floor, her knees aching as she whispered the Psalms into the darkness. Saint Elizabeth realized that the lazaretto was not just a prison, but a desert where God spoke to the heart. The silence began to transform from a threat into a sacred, waiting mystery. William's eyes, bright with fever, watched her from the shadows of his sickbed. Saint Elizabeth saw his strength fading like a candle in a drafty hallway, yet her own resolve was hardening like the stone around them. She was becoming the pillar of a crumbling, earthly temple. The salt spray from the Mediterranean seeped through the cracks, stinging her skin and reminding her of the vastness outside. Saint Elizabeth felt the smallness of her own will against the immense, silent designs of providence. She was learning to breathe in the thin air of pure, naked faith. As the month of isolation drew to a close, the woman who emerged from the lazaretto was no longer the socialite of New York. Saint Elizabeth had looked into the abyss of silence and found a quiet light. The stone cell had been the womb of her coming transformation. The winter sun over Pisa was a pale, mocking disk as Saint Elizabeth knelt by the bedside of her beloved William. The scent of lavender and old stone hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of his final struggle for breath. On December 27th, 1803, the weary merchant finally surrendered to the silent call of eternity. Saint Elizabeth felt a profound, staggering void open within her chest, as if the very earth of Italy had swallowed her future. She was a widow, alone in a land of strangers. "My love, you have crossed the great sea before me," she whispered, her fingers tracing his cooling brow. The silence of the room was absolute, a heavy shroud that threatened to crush her spirit. Yet, beneath the grief, Saint Elizabeth sensed a strange, budding hunger for something eternal. Her tears were not merely for the loss of a husband, but for the shattering of her earthly idols. Saint Elizabeth stood by the window, watching the Arno River flow toward the sea, realizing that every human anchor had finally been cut. She was adrift in God's vast ocean. The Filiki family offered their hands and hearts, their Catholic kindness a warm hearth in her frozen world. Saint Elizabeth observed their quiet devotion, a peace that seemed to transcend the tragedies of life. She began to wonder if their faith held the key to her longing. While walking through the ancient, echoing streets of Pisa, she felt the gaze of the statues and the weight of centuries of prayer. Saint Elizabeth realized that her soul was no longer satisfied with the dry husks of her past. A divine restlessness was taking hold. "Lord, show me the way to the heart of your truth," she cried out in the darkness of her lonely room. Saint Elizabeth felt the first stirrings of a spiritual appetite that only the bread of life could satisfy. The widow was becoming a seeker of the true fold. The shadows of death had not extinguished her light. They had merely stripped away the veils of vanity. Saint Elizabeth looked toward the distant cathedrals, her heart beating with a new, quiet intensity. In the wreckage of her marriage, the great romance with her Creator was beginning. The heavy scent of incense and old candle wax drifted through the vast, echoing transept of the Santa Maria del Fiore. Saint Elizabeth stood in the golden shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The marble floor felt cold beneath her weary, widowed feet. She watched with bated breath as the Filiki family knelt in a profound, rhythmic silence that she could not yet name. The atmosphere was thick with a presence that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the cathedral. Saint Elizabeth felt a sudden, piercing longing for this sacred mystery. "If I am right, thy grace impart," she whispered into the hallowed air, her eyes fixed upon the distant, flickering sanctuary lamp. The quiet light of the tabernacle beckoned her, promising a bread that could finally satisfy her starving soul. She felt the old world of shadows crumbling. When the priest raised the white host, a silence deeper than death descended upon the kneeling multitude. Saint Elizabeth shivered, sensing a divine fire that burned without consuming. In that luminous moment, the reality of the real presence struck her heart with the force of a tidal wave. She saw the tears of devotion on the faces of the Italian peasants. A simple, raw faith that transcended her sophisticated New York upbringing. Saint Elizabeth realized that this was not a mere symbol, but the living God. The hunger within her became an agonizing, beautiful, and holy fire. The rhythmic chanting of the choir seemed to weave a bridge between heaven and the dusty, sorrowful earth. Saint Elizabeth felt the heavy weight of her grief being lifted by an invisible, Eucharistic hand. She was no longer a stranger in a foreign land. She was a child coming home. "Oh, to possess him as they do," she cried out in the silence of her searching mind. The mystery of the altar became the compass of her soul, pointing her toward a shore she had never dreamed existed. Saint Elizabeth was being undone by the sheer beauty of the truth. As she left the cathedral, the Tuscan sun felt warmer, the air fresher, and her purpose clearer. Saint Elizabeth looked at the world through eyes that had glimpsed the bread of life. The journey toward the fullness of the faith had truly and irrevocably begun in her heart. The salt-crusted hull of the vessel cut through the slate-gray waters of New York Harbor in June 1804. Saint Elizabeth stood at the railing, her widow's weeds fluttering like a dark signal against the horizon. The familiar skyline looked jagged, cold, and strangely unrecognizable to her transformed soul. The scent of rotting timber and harbor mud rose to meet her. a sharp contrast to the incense of Italy. She clutched the railing, feeling the heavy gaze of the city she once ruled as a social queen. Saint Elizabeth sensed a brewing storm that no barometer could ever measure. Her heart hammered with a rhythmic anxiety as the docks drew closer, crowded with faces that felt like pale ghosts. The elite of Manhattan waited, but their welcome was a wall of polite, icy silence. Saint Elizabeth realized she was returning not as a daughter, but as a stranger. "They will not understand the fire that burns within me now," she whispered, her fingers tracing the small crucifix. The vibrant warmth of the Mediterranean was a world away, replaced by the biting social frost of her Anglican roots. Saint Elizabeth felt the terrifying weight of her new isolation. Her friends spoke of trade and tea, their voices thin and hollow against the echoing memory of the Eucharist. Saint Elizabeth tried to share the light she found in the cathedrals, but saw only suspicion in their eyes. She was an exile in her own parlor, a prisoner of grace. The once bright ballrooms now felt like echoing tombs of vanity, filled with the whispers of those who called her deluded. Saint Elizabeth endured the subtle stings of mockery with a quiet, agonizing patience. She was learning that the path to truth is paved with the stones of rejection. Poverty nipped at the edges of her life. Yet the spiritual hunger she brought from Pisa was her only true hunger. Saint Elizabeth spent her nights in a lonely vigil, the flickering candle casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. She was waiting for a sign from the great silent master. As the sun set over the Hudson, casting a bruised purple light across the city, she felt a profound, holy resolve. Saint Elizabeth knew the bridges to her past were burning, and she did not reach for the water. The favorite daughter was ready to become a servant of the cross. A biting March wind swept through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan, carrying the scent of wood smoke in old winter. Saint Elizabeth stood before the heavy doors of St. Peter's Church on Barclay Street. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat for a soldier entering a battlefield. Inside, the dim sanctuary felt like a different world, heavy with the aroma of beeswax and ancient prayers. It was Ash Wednesday, 1805. Saint Elizabeth moved through the shadows, feeling the invisible weight of her Protestant family's collective disapproval. She was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. "Lord, if I am wrong, teach my heart," she whispered, her voice a mere tremor in the hallowed silence. Father Matthew O'Brien waited at the altar, a stern yet compassionate figure in the candlelight. Saint Elizabeth felt the sharp sting of tears, realizing the immense cost of her thirsty soul's longing. As the priest traced the dark cross of ashes upon her forehead, she felt a profound, searing seal of ownership. Saint Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting the world of New York's high society fall away into a gray mist. She was dust, but dust now claimed by the King of Kings. The social storm outside raged with whispers of popery and betrayal, echoing through the parlors of her former friends. Saint Elizabeth ignored the phantom voices, focusing only on the rhythmic flickering of the sanctuary lamp. Her isolation was deepening, but a divine warmth was beginning to thaw her frozen spirit. She knelt on the hard wooden floor, her knees aching with a sweet, penitential fatigue. Saint Elizabeth felt the gaze of the statues, silent witnesses to her surrender. The agonizing spiritual perplexity of the past months was finally dissolving into a quiet, luminous certainty. She had found the better way. "Take all I have, but give me yourself." Her soul cried out in a wordless prayer of total abandonment. Saint Elizabeth realized that the rejection of her kin was the price of her true citizenship in heaven. She was becoming a stranger to the world, but a daughter to the church. Leaving the church, the cold wind no longer bit quite so sharply against her face. Saint Elizabeth walked with a new quiet authority, her forehead marked with the sign of the repentant. The threshold was crossed. The widow had become a Catholic, and the long, difficult journey of grace had begun. The elegant parlors of Manhattan were now cold, shuttered fortresses against her. Saint Elizabeth walked the cobblestone streets, feeling the stinging frost of social exclusion that cut deeper than the winter wind. Her former friends turned their heads, their silences echoing like the closing of iron gates. Poverty began to gnaw at the edges of her household, a relentless predator smelling blood. The mahogany furniture was sold, leaving hollow spaces that mirrored the void in her social standing. Saint Elizabeth looked at her hungry children, her heart heavy with the agonizing weight of their innocence. Whispers of a dangerous proselytizer reached the mahogany halls of the New York legislature. Powerful men debated her very presence, threatening to exile the widow for the crime of her conscience. Saint Elizabeth felt the suffocating pressure of a world determined to crush her newfound, luminous light. "They may take my home, but they cannot take my king," she whispered in the candlelit darkness of her small room. The threat of expulsion loomed like a dark thundercloud over the Hudson. Saint Elizabeth realized that the cancel culture of 1806 was a brutal test of her spiritual marrow. Her sister-in-law, Cecilia, lay ill, begging for the touch of the ostracized convert. Saint Elizabeth ignored the warnings of the elite, stepping into the lion's den of her family's anger. She saw in Cecilia's fevered eyes the same thirst for truth that had once nearly consumed her. The air in the city felt thick with suspicion, every shadow hiding a critic or a spy. Saint Elizabeth struggled with a weary, human fear that sometimes threatened to extinguish her courage. She was a mother fighting for bread, while a saint fought for the dignity of the cross. "Lord, preserve my life, for I trust in you," she prayed, her fingers gripping the worn edges of her psalm book. The isolation was absolute, yet the real presence she had discovered in Italy remained her invisible, unbreakable anchor. Saint Elizabeth was learning to stand tall in the wreckage. Even as the boarding house failed and her resources dwindled to nothing, her spirit refused to bend. Saint Elizabeth looked toward the horizon, sensing that the rejection of New York was a divine redirection. The exile was being prepared for a wilderness where her true mission would finally bloom. The salt-misted air of the New York docks felt like a heavy shroud as Saint Elizabeth turned her back on the city of her birth. Every cobblestone she left behind was a fragment of a shattered dream. She clutched her children close, feeling the rhythmic sway of the departing vessel. Father Dubourg had spoken of a new horizon in Baltimore, a sanctuary where the seeds of faith could finally take root. Saint Elizabeth watched the Manhattan skyline dissolve into a gray, ghostly blur. She was answering a call that felt more like a divine command than a mere invitation. The scent of damp timber and churning river water filled her senses, a raw, elemental perfume of transition. Saint Elizabeth struggled with a weary, human doubt that whispered of failure in the coming wilderness. Yet, she looked at the horizon, sensing the invisible hand of the great silent Master. "Is this the land of promise, Lord? Or another desert?" she wondered as the Chesapeake Bay opened its arms. The boat's rhythmic creaking was the only answer to her soul's anxious inquiry. Saint Elizabeth felt the immense weight of being a pioneer in a world that still feared her cross. They reached the Baltimore wharves on the feast of Corpus Christi, 1808, the air thick with the humidity of a southern summer. Saint Elizabeth stepped onto the soil of Maryland, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She smelled the rich red earth, a promise of life hidden within the dust. The humble chapel of St. Mary's Seminary became her first refuge, its quiet light a balm for her travel-worn spirit. St. Elizabeth knelt on the hard floor, feeling the profound, Eucharistic warmth she had craved since Italy. Here, the bread of life was no longer a distant, forbidden treasure. She looked at her 3 daughters, their faces pale but expectant in the flickering candlelight of the new school. St. Elizabeth realized that her suffering in New York had been the necessary pruning for this budding vineyard. She was no longer a social exile. She was a builder of souls. The wilderness of Maryland was vast and daunting, yet her spirit felt a strange, new freedom. St. Elizabeth breathed in the scent of pine and incense, ready to lay the first stones of an empire of charity. The journey to Baltimore was the beginning of her true, eternal homecoming. The morning mist clung to the red bricks of Baltimore, a soft shroud over a burgeoning world. St. Elizabeth moved with a quiet, renewed purpose, her eyes fixed on the small chapel where the real presence breathed. A new era was dawning, born from the wreckage of her past. A few devoted souls, drawn by the same divine fire, gathered around the widow. Their quaint black habits, inspired by Italian mourning dress, whispered of a world they had already left behind. Saint Elizabeth felt the heavy, sacred weight of leadership as they sought her steady, prayerful guidance. "We are but small seeds in a vast, dry field, Lord," she whispered, her fingers tracing the worn beads of her rosary. The scent of fresh ink and old hymnals filled their humble rooms, the aroma of a mission taking shape. Saint Elizabeth was becoming the mother of many. In 1809, before the silent gaze of Archbishop Carroll, she pronounced her private vows of poverty and obedience. A profound, luminous peace settled over her travel-worn spirit, a seal that no earthly storm could ever break. Saint Elizabeth had finally found the anchor for her restless, seeking soul. The title Mother Seton began to echo through the halls, a name that carried the authority of suffering and grace. She looked at her biological children and her spiritual daughters, realizing their destinies were now irrevocably entwined. Saint Elizabeth felt the immense, beautiful burden of this dual motherhood. Challenges rose like thorns in a new garden. Yet her resolve remained as hard as the stones of the lazaretto. While some questioned the wisdom of a widow leading a sisterhood, she focused on the quiet light of the tabernacle. Saint Elizabeth knew the architect was not a man. The air was thick with the anticipation of a great journey as they prepared to leave for the hills of Emmitsburg. She breathed in the smell of pine and promise, sensing the invisible hand of Providence guiding their footsteps. Saint Elizabeth was ready to build a house for the king. The era of Mother Seton was not one of comfort, but of a fierce, uncompromising charity that sought the broken. She looked toward the horizon, her heart beating with the rhythmic certainty of the gospel. The foundation was laid, not in stone, but in the fire of love. The iron-rimmed wheels of the wagon groaned as they climbed the rugged slopes toward Emmitsburg in June 1809. Saint Elizabeth looked out over the wild, untamed Maryland landscape, her heart heavy with a sacred trepidation. The valley felt like a beautiful green prison waiting for its first captives. Their new home, a small stone farmhouse, breathed a chill that even the summer sun could not thaw. The scent of damp earth and rotting timber filled the narrow rooms, a stark contrast to New York's mahogany splendor. Saint Elizabeth touched the cold walls, feeling the embrace of a voluntary, holy poverty. Winter arrived with a predatory howl, rattling the thin window panes like a restless ghost seeking entry. Inside, Saint Elizabeth and her sisters huddled together, their breath misting in the freezing air of the common room. The aroma of thin, watery soup was the only warmth in their desolate limestone sanctuary. Lord, let this hunger be a banquet for our souls, she whispered, her fingers numbed by the biting frost. Saint Elizabeth felt the agonizing weight of her children's shivering forms, a trial that tested her maternal heart to its breaking point. She was learning the terrible, beautiful cost of total surrender. Every morning, they rose in the pitch-black darkness, their feet finding the icy floor with a rhythmic, penitential precision. Saint Elizabeth led the way to the tiny chapel, the flickering candle casting long, dancing shadows of devotion. Here, in the freezing silence, the quiet light of the tabernacle remained their only fire. Mortification was not a theory in Emmitsburg. It was the very air they breathed, sharp and thin. Saint Elizabeth embraced the labor of the laundry in the kitchen, her hands cracked and bleeding from the relentless cold. She found a strange, hidden joy in the wreckage of her physical comfort. The sisters watched their mother, seeing a woman of tempered steel whose spirit seemed to expand as her body withered. Saint Elizabeth realized that the stone walls were not barriers, but the foundation of an eternal temple. She was forging a community in the furnace of an absolute, shivering necessity. As the snow buried the valley, the world outside felt like a distant, fading memory of vanity and silk. Saint Elizabeth looked into the darkness, her soul anchored by the real presence in their midst. The Valley of Trials had become the threshing floor where the wheat was finally separated from the chaff. The iron-gray sky of Maryland hung low over the valley of Emmitsburg, heavy with the scent of damp earth and impending winter. Inside the stone house, Saint Elizabeth felt a familiar, cold shiver. Death was no longer a stranger. It was a persistent visitor at her threshold. Her eldest, Anna Maria, lay pale against the coarse linens, her breath a flickering candle in a drafty hallway. Saint Elizabeth knelt by the bed, her heart a tangled knot of maternal agony and supernatural surrender. She watched the light of her own flesh slowly fading away. My Savior, you asked for all, and now you take the fruit of my womb, she whispered into the hallowed silence. In 1812, Anna joined the Eternal Choir, leaving Saint Elizabeth with a void that no earthly comfort could fill. The sword of sorrow was piercing her deeply. Years later, the shadow returned for young Rebecca, whose long suffering had been a quiet litany of patience. Saint Elizabeth held her daughter's trembling hand, smelling the sharp tang of medicinal herbs and the sweet, heavy aroma of incense. The house of stone felt like a Gethsemane. She walked to the small cemetery behind the woods, the autumn leaves crunching beneath her weary, consecrated feet. 2 small mounds of earth represented the ultimate sacrifice of her New York life. Saint Elizabeth stood before the crosses, her spirit stripped of every human vanity. "Thy will, not mine, be done," her soul cried out, even as tears blurred the jagged horizon of the hills. She realized that God was not found in the absence of grief, but in the very center of the furnace. Saint Elizabeth was becoming a living altar of sacrifice. The sisters watched their mother from the shadows, seeing a woman whose eyes held a depth born of holy fire. While her body felt the crushing weight of fatigue, her spirit soared toward the tabernacle. Saint Elizabeth found the real presence was her only remaining anchor. Through the mist of her mourning, a new, radiant clarity began to emerge. Like a sunburst through storm clouds, she understood that burying her daughters was the final bridge to her true, heavenly country. Saint Elizabeth turned back to her mission, her heart irrevocably belonging to Christ. A century had passed, yet the stone walls of the New Orleans infirmary breathed the same heavy humidity of human suffering. Sister Gertrude Kortzendorfer lay skeletal against the white linens, her body consumed by the invisible fire of terminal pancreatic cancer. Death's shadow was long. The scent of sterile alcohol and the humid, swampy air of Louisiana pressed against the window panes. Doctors had folded their hands in defeat, leaving only the rhythmic ticking of the clock to mark her final hours. Sister Gertrude felt the cold, creeping approach of the great silence. In the dim light of the ward, the sisters of the community gathered, their black habits blending into the gathering gloom. They did not look to the medicine bottles, but toward a flickering candle and the intercession of their holy foundress. Saint Elizabeth was called upon. "Mother Seton, you who knew the agony of the sickbed, plead for us," they whispered in a low, fervent litany. A small relic of the saint was pressed against the dying sister's wasted frame. The atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted, becoming thick with a holy, electric expectation. Beneath the heavy blankets, Sister Gertrude felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of warmth, as if a quiet light had ignited within her very marrow. The agonizing pressure in her abdomen dissolved like mist under a summer sun. She drew a deep, effortless breath that startled the weary watchers. The morning sun rose over the Mississippi, finding a woman whom science had already surrendered to the grave sitting upright. The malignant masses had vanished, leaving the surgeons in a state of bewildered, clinical silence. Saint Elizabeth had reached through the veil to touch her daughter. "It is not I, but the Master of Life who has done this." The spirit of the saint seemed to whisper through the miracle. The healing was not a mere physical restoration. It was a luminous sign of the invisible kingdom's proximity. The infirmary had become a sacred threshold. This first official miracle rippled through the church like a stone thrown into a still, deep pond. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton was proving that her charity was not buried in the Maryland soil. She remained a living bridge between the suffering earth and the eternal, healing heavens. The sterile white halls of St. Agnes Hospital felt like a cold, echoing labyrinth in 1952. 4-year-old Anne Teresa O'Neill lay amidst the tangled sheets, her small body besieged by the invisible fire of acute leukemia. The scent of antiseptic and hopeless despair was thick. Doctors spoke in hushed, clinical tones of a death that was now inevitable, a relentless ticking toward the abyss. Anne's parents watched with a dry, hollow agony, their hearts breaking against the silence of the wards. The shadow of the scythe was visible in her pale, translucent skin. A sister of the community, her black habit rustling like wings, brought a small, humble relic of Saint Elizabeth. She pinned the cloth to the child's gown, her eyes burning with a fierce, supernatural certainty. Mother Seton, save this little flower for the glory of his kingdom. A 9-day storm of prayer, a novena, began to swirl around the dying girl's bed. On Good Friday, as the world mourned the crucified, Anne's breath slowed to a fragile, ghostly whisper. Saint Elizabeth was being petitioned with the desperate, rhythmic tears of a mother's broken heart. Then came Easter Monday, the morning of the great resurrection light. Anne Teresa opened her eyes, the feverish fog having vanished like mist over the Chesapeake Bay. She sat upright, her blood values having returned to a perfect, inexplicable harmony. The doctors stood in stunned, absolute silence. Hematologists peered through their microscopes, searching for a medical reason that simply did not exist. The marrow was clean. The predator had fled. Saint Elizabeth had reached across the centuries to touch the dying child of Baltimore, proving that the real presence never truly leaves. The news rippled across the Atlantic, shaking the heavy stone halls of the Vatican with its luminous clarity. This was no mere coincidence, but a divine signature upon the life of America's first saint. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton was showing the world the power of a mother's intercession. And Teresa, the miracle girl, became a living testament to a love that survives the grave. She walked the world as a breathing prayer, a sign that the quiet light of Emmitsburg still burned. The legacy of Saint Elizabeth was once again written in the blood of life. The winter of 1821 arrived at Emmitsburg with a hushed, reverent stillness. Inside her small room, Saint Elizabeth felt the final, shallow rhythms of her earthly breath. The scent of wood smoke and old beeswax drifted through the stone house, marking the approach of a great, holy silence. Her pulmonary struggle was not a defeat, but a gradual unfolding into the light. Saint Elizabeth looked at the flickering sanctuary lamp through the open door, her soul already reaching for the real presence. The weight of her weary, wasted frame was finally becoming as light as a prayer. "Be children of the church," she whispered to the weeping sisters gathered around her bed. Her voice was a mere rustle of dry leaves, yet it carried the authority of a lifetime spent in the furnace. Saint Elizabeth was ready to trade her widow's weeds for a wedding garment. On January 4th, the first American altar of a native saint began to form in the spirit. As the morning sun touched the Maryland hills, Saint Elizabeth crossed the final threshold. The quiet light she had followed from New York to Italy had finally led her home to stay. Decades later, the heavy bronze bells of St. Peter's in Rome announced her glory to the world. In 1975, Pope Paul VI declared her a saint, the firstborn of the American soil. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton had become a permanent bridge between the old world and the new. The humble schoolteacher from the valley now stood among the celestial hierarchy, crowned with the gold of charity. Thousands of American faithful looked toward Emmitsburg, feeling a profound, ancestral pride in their mother. Saint Elizabeth proved that the path to sanctity runs through the heart of daily duty. Her legacy was written in the countless hospitals and schools that bloomed from her small, frozen seed. Saint Elizabeth survived the shipwreck, the bankruptcy, and the graveyard to become an eternal beacon. She was no longer just a woman of history. She was a living, breathing intercessor. As the incense rose in the great basilica, the story of the anatomist's daughter reached its divine crescendo. Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, the compromising widow and uncompromising Catholic, remains our guide. In the darkness of the modern world, her quiet, luminous light continues to burn forever bright.